This week marks the 93rd birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He died at age 39 from assassination. In a short lifetime, King accomplished more than most, but the goal of equal rights in the USA remains undone. We must build upon his legacy just as he built upon those who came before him. To move forward with justice, we must know what has gone before. History likes to hold up heroes, singular people that were leaders, that we can focus. But a good leader knows, as Dr. King knows, that any movement rests with the people. And people of every age have done whatever they can to make this world better. Here in New Bern, we have a wonderful opportunity to walk the African American Heritage Trail. We can literally walk in the footsteps of previous freedom seekers. The development of the signs has been a 5-year project guided by a committee chaired by local historian Bernard George and sponsored by the historic Dry Borough Neighborhood Association, the New Bern Historical Society, the City of New Bern, and the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. They were unveiled at last summer's Juneteenth celebration. A few months ago, there was a tour that I missed because I had something else scheduled. Otherwise, I would have been in that video that preceded the sermon. Well, I was glad to see that some of our members were there. These signs basically describe the history of Dryboro and the Five Points area from the pre-Civil War era to the mid-20th century. So they are contained in a 4x4 block area of the city, with Miller Street to the west, George Street to the east, Cedar Street to the north, and Broad Street to the south. And Queen runs on diagonal right through it. A helpful map of the area can be found at visitnewbern.com. Click on the African American Heritage Trail Guide. Now the map is set up so you can move the shortest distance from one site to the other. But since we are here in one place, or online, we can't walk the trail today. Not that any of us would want to do it when it's 35 degrees and raining. But we are in a very warm area. I imagine within the month, within Black History Month of February, there will be a nice day where you can walk or drive and see these signs for yourself. I'm going to go through these signs chronologically. Since history is seldom lived along a straight line, I will be all over the map. I'm going to begin in the pre-Civil War area around Dryboro. Whenever I saw the sign for Dryboro, I thought maybe this is a spot in this swamp we live in that actually has dry land. No, it was actually named after somebody named Dry. But I started at the northeast corner, at the corner of Cedar and George Street, near the Cedar Grove Cemetery. It was platted in 1806 and it was actually the second town established in Craven County. And it was integrated and contained both black and white artisans. On the sign it reads, African Americans have played an active and prominent role in the history of New Bern since well before the American Revolution. The earliest enslaved blacks arrived at our inland seaports aboard ships from the West Indies or directly from Africa. Others came from Maryland and Virginia colonies as free blacks, untethered by the institution of slavery, but still subject to the authority and control of white-dominant governments and institutions. By 1820, the total number of black New Bernians, free and enslaved, surpassed the white population. At the time, the North Carolina Constitution gave more rights to free blacks than any other southern state. Among those living in New Bern were prosperous artisans, farmers, and shopkeepers. However, a result of the hysteria generated by Nat Turner slave rebellion in 1831 in Virginia, North Carolina began restricting the rights of blacks. In 1832, the legislature forbade them from entering the state. And in 1835, those already living in North Carolina lost their right to vote. So they were able to vote up until 1835. Free blacks. They were further barred from preaching in public, owning a gun. That sacred Second Amendment rights was suspended for a certain portion of the population and had never been extended to slaves. As the county moved towards civil war, black New Bernians felt the wrath of a divided nation. Now, Cedar Grove was Dryboro was originally pretty much an integrated place. It was kind of where the working place lived, the working place neighborhood. The first encroachment on it was at the foundation of Cedar Grove Cemetery. There had been a plague and there were many deaths and they needed a cemetery, and so it was placed into that area. And the Cedar Grove Cemetery kept on expanding and now takes up probably about a third of what the old neighborhood of Dryboro was. Dryboro was officially became part of New Bern in 1859. But in Cedar Grove Cemetery, bodies were of black people and white people were both buried in Cedar Grove. But in 1908, the city decided to exhume the black bodies and move them to Greenwood Cemetery, the cemetery that they had created for black people in the 1880s. So you can see just in this first sign how public policy changes with the whims of the people, and that things that seem to be rights and natural things, the freedom to live and to die and to rest in peace, can be changed when the people just want to change the laws for their own whims. If you have time to visit only one location, I recommend George Street at the intersection with Queen. It's kitty corner from the police station. And it has three signs that explain the Civil War and Reconstruction. The first is fighting for freedom. In 1862, the New Bern was liberated by Union forces, and slaves from nearby communities came. And there's a picture that appeared in Atlantic magazine on this sign of all the people coming, refugees from slave territories, coming to this city. And many signed up to be Union soldiers. The free blacks of the area also joined, urged by a poster that's on the sign that asked, Are free men less brave than slaves? In May 1863, the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers, known as the African Brigade, was mustered in New Bern. And they were led by Colonel James Beecher, half-brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. William Henry Singleton, an African-American, served as a sergeant, and 2 additional regiments, the 36th and 37th, along with the Carolina Colored Heavy Artillery, were also formed. More than 5,000 men enlisted into U.S. colored troops in New Bern. After the war, there was the push to become citizens of the Republic. In 1864, the National Equal Rights League was created to promote full and immediate citizenship for African Americans. Led by Frederick Douglass, the organization argued that the battlefield sacrifices entitled all black males the right to vote, and that citizenship should be extended to all black men and women. Abraham Galloway was a local man who served on the national committees, and he went and visited the president. And then the last sign at this site is winds of change. Because after the initial success of the Civil War, black legislators were elected all across the South. But there was pushback. And in Wilmington, there was even a riot to overturn an election of a black mayor, or of a party that promoted integration. The white supremacists kept on chipping away at the laws. After federal troops left in 1870, more and more restrictions of the Jim Crow era came. The citizens of New Bern resisted because there was such a history here of free blacks and some of the first freed slaves, that there are people among the people and enough votes to carry forth some of these things. In fact, New Bern was the last area in the South to have an African American congressman until 1901. After George White left Congress, no African American was elected to Congress from the state of North Carolina until 1992. So freedom and democracy was growing, and forces took the effort to stop it, to enforce white supremacy. Now at the other far corner, at the south, I always get confused in this town because the town's kind of on an angle, but I'm going to call it the southwest corner, is a sign for the Army of the Grand Republic. And that was a veterans organization, and they formed it here because there were so many veterans that were here. And the local post was named after Beecher, their white commander. But there was a pretty distinctive member of that veterans group named Isaac Powell. Born in Washington, North Carolina, Isaac Powell enlisted in the Federal Army in December of 1863 at the age 18. As a member of the 37th U.S. Colored Troops, he saw action in numerous campaigns in Virginia, including Petersburg and the battles of Richmond around 1864. Powell also served in several North Carolina engagements at Fort Fisher and the capture of Wilmington in 1865. His regiment was present at the surrender of the Confederate Army at Bennett Place on April 26, 1865, bringing an end to the Civil War. In 1893, Isaac Powell was appointed the Beecher Post Commander, a position he held for 16 years. His stature within the great army of the Republic grew, and in 1906 he was elected commander of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. Powell was the only African American to hold that position over the combined black and white posts in the South. So this is a man in the middle of deconstruction, after Reconstruction, still gathered enough support among Union soldiers, both white and black, to be the commander of two states. Another thing that has moved the African American community in New Bern forward is the churches. During the latter half of the 19th century, the emergence of independent black congregations and black churches gave them the opportunity for the first time to gain control of their community's spiritual life. Prior to the 1830s, black New Bernians, for the most part, worshiped along white congregations, perhaps seated in the separate sections of the chapel. Black ministers were, on occasion, allowed to perform services. In 1831, however, panic spread across the slave-holding South following the Virginia Rebellion led by Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher. States in the region, including North Carolina, enacted laws restricting the movement, marriage, and education of blacks, free and slave. Black ministers especially were banned from conducting services, fear of fomenting insurrection. Not until after the Civil War did they fully grasp the chance to establish separate denominations. In 1843, Andrews Chapel became New Bern's first independent black church. However, there was a white minister was appointed to conduct the services just to make sure that they didn't get out of line. The Civil War made New Bern fertile ground for northern black missionaries. 1864, James Walker Hood founded the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, and a church called St. Peter's. That's right there near Cedar Grove. The Clinton Chapel was formed later that year. That's down closer to the Trent River. And then the St. Cyprian's was an Episcopal church that's right there by Cedar Grove Cemetery, also on Queen Street. And there were advances in education. On West Street, there's a sign about the West Street Graded School. Now, it started in the 1870s and had a wooden structure, but it was destroyed by fire in 1905. However, the school's new principal, John Thomas Barber, successfully pushed to build the state's first African-American brick schoolhouse 2 years later. More classrooms were added to the campus, and the school grew. J.T. Barber died in 1944, and in 1945 a school was named after him. There is a sign along Queen Street, which was kind of the unofficial dividing line between blacks and whites in New Bern. And there you can learn about the Roan sisters, who in 1923 founded the Roan Hotel. And it was one of those hotels that was famously in the Green Book, showed black people where they could stay if they were traveling in the South. There's a placard to the Great Fire in 1922. It pretty much took out this whole area where these signs are. In 1922, New Bern's African American community was decimated by a major fire. More than 3,000 people were displaced, as hundreds of structures were consumed in a blaze that caused over $2 million in damage. Early in the morning of December 1, sparks from equipment ignited dust at Roland Lumber Company, located in the banks of the Neuse River. Within minutes, the largest lumber mill in North Carolina was ablaze. Fueled by high winds off the channel, the fire jumped to train tracks and greatly spread south to nearby wooden clapboard and single-roofed homes. A few hours later, a faulty chimney at a house at 30 Kilmarock Street, north of 5 Point, started a second fire that converged with the blaze from the mill. Residents fled. Those unable to escape sought refuge in the Cedar Grove Cemetery. Adding to the tragedy, Fire Chief James Bryan was forced to call for assistance from nearby Kinston and Washington because the local firefighters were away in Raleigh to watch New Bern play Eastern North Carolina in the state football championship. Also on West Street, there is a sign that's dedicated to Good Shepherd Hospital in the West Street Colored Library. The Great Fire of 1922 exposed the urgent need for a hospital in New Bern, segregated African American community. At the time, the closest colored hospital, and I'm reading from the signs so that my use of archaic language to describe is because the language is of the day that these events took place. The closest colored hospital was 80 miles away. Supported by the efforts of Robert J.I. Johnson, Good Shepherd Hospital opened in 1938. And it was funded by the Episcopal Diocese and the Duke Endowment. And this is what's interesting to me. It's like when you think of how slow things work. In 1922, they realized there was a need for an African American hospital, and it took them 16 years to get it built. And also on that street in the same area, and this is also the area where the school was. There was a public library that was funded by the Rowan sisters, who also had funded the hotel. So you have this town rising up like a phoenix from the ashes, building institutions like schools and hospitals. And if you go to the corner of Queen and Broad and start moving up Queen Street, you'll see a beautiful mural on one of the buildings. This one's fairly old, so it's starting to fade, but it shows a phoenix rising out of the ashes of the Great Fire. During the Great Depression, under President Roosevelt, funds were approved for public housing. And that's when the Craven Terrace and Trent Court, which is down by the river where we do our river cleanup, were built in 1940. Now, public housing was a boon to those who had no hope of buying land in a segregated South, but it also had the side effect of hardening the lines of segregation between neighborhoods, because there was housing that was now deemed only for black people. Craven has a unique story that in 1942, author Alex Haley was serving in the Navy, and he found housing at Craven Terrace. He even got married in apartment C22. He went on to write the autobiography of Malcolm X with Malcolm X and Roots, which was turned into the famous TV miniseries. And I end this summary at 5 points. The intersection of Neuse, Broad, Roundtree, and Queen Streets known locally as 5 Points, is recognized as New Bern's historic western gateway. From the 1860s through the 1950s, the crossroads south of Dryborough and Craven Terrace neighborhoods witnessed tremendous change, which began in the late 19th century as an avenue of racially and economically diverse shops, soon became for African Americans. After World War II, 5 Points was reborn as a crossroads district and bustled with more vibrant commercial center. Had an A&P store and a Ben Franklin national chains, but more importantly, there was lots of locally owned black businesses, and there was the Palace Theater, which did not restrict black audiences to the balcony, as the white theaters downtown. And that kind of ends the time period of these signs. They run from before the Civil War to after World War II, kind of up to the point of the civil rights movement that Dr. King was associated with. And there was lots of things that happened in addition to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement broke down the walls of segregation so that when suburban sprawl or urban sprawl came out and you'd have big national chains on the other side of Highway 70, not only did they decimate these the black-owned businesses, but they decimated the downtown area as well of white small businesses. Just small business just generally has had a rough time since the 60s in America. And this town has worked to build and rebuild and make the downtown area a thriving touristy area with shops and restaurants. And the placement of these signs and making this a destination for people to go, for it's on our tourist site, so people will come and they'll walk and they'll see these signs. And they will also see a neighborhood that needs help. And this country always talks about the great, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, this community has done it time and time again. And when we see development that happens in white neighborhoods, there's usually some government funding that's helping that out. Something that expands the streets and does the infrastructure that allows all the big box stores to exist west of 70. And so it's a false argument that the government shouldn't be involved in helping revitalize neighborhoods. All neighborhoods can use some help in promoting small businesses, because small businesses are the ones that create the most jobs in America. Whether it's in a small Appalachian town that's all white, or a small town in Mississippi that's all black, or in an integrated community like New Bern. These policies that are created by governments and governments that are voted upon by us create justice and create the conditions for people to grow emotionally, financially, and spiritually. We live in a very strange time. That I think there was Reconstruction, and then there was Jim Crow, and then there was civil rights, which I think culminated with the election of our first black president. But since then, there has been such a backlash against anything that appears fair, because the people who are invested in a white supremacist country want to keep things the same. But throughout this whole story, there were whites and blacks who worked together in political parties, in businesses, And that is the path that we can continue to take. And we have so much else going on in this country. We have influxes of immigrants in this town, particularly from Burma, and then also from Nigeria, which are truly African Americans from Africa who have not experienced all the history that those who were raised from slaves. And the idea in this town of meeting some people, when I first met Bernard George, who is behind this project, I think I was here for about a month, and I was attending something at the Tryon Center. And he talked about how his family had 7 generations of freed black people working in this town. And that is such an amazing legacy that this town exists. We are quite a unique town in the South, partly because we were a port. And at ports, there was a little bit more freedom for everybody. I mean, freedom to be a sailor. There was not much freedom in being a sailor. A sailor of any race on a boat was essentially a slave to the captain, but someone could go to sea and be their own person. And then also those supporting and all the work of craftsmen and stuff to support the industry in this area created a unique situation which gives New Bern some hidden strength of history that maybe some other communities in the South don't have. And these are the relationships and the understandings that we can rely on as we move forward to make a better community. A community that's not just a dream. The dream speech was in 1963. That's nearly 59 years ago. It's really way past time to put some plans and some infrastructure under that dream. And I hope we can do that beginning today and carrying on to the future. May we bless and be blessed.